Man in Black Cloak. The sun shone down on a small village nestled among towering mountains. An old suspension bridge stretched across the rushing St. River, its wooden planks creaking in the wind. His name was Brandon, and he was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of books as he prepared for the bar exam. The stress weighed heavily on him, and he decided to take a break in a secluded spot. Stepping outside, the chilly late October air hit him. Brandon walked past a few nearby houses, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot creating a soothing sound. As he approached the suspension bridge, he gazed at the rushing river below. He closed his eyes, taking in the fresh air of nature. Suddenly, he felt the presence of someone nearby. He opened his eyes and saw a man in a black cloak standing in the middle of the bridge, fully shrouded. Brandon's heart raced as he saw the man drawing something on the railing of the bridge. A sense of unease rose within him, and he chose to avoid the man, turning back toward the forest along the riverbank. The overgrown trail ahead was thick with brush. He carefully tread over the uneven ground, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety after his encounter with the man. Emerging from the foliage, he reached the creek's edge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. A brief sense of peace washed over him, but it was fleeting. In the fading light, Brandon saw flickering flames ahead. Confusion filled him, as he had expected to be alone out here. Curiosity rose despite his unease. Brandon moved closer, the crackling sound of the fire growing louder. As he approached, he saw 3 people in black cloaks standing around a man who looked injured, bound and covered in blood, lying on the ground. He could only hold his breath in fear. The flickering torchlight cast strange shadows, making the scene even more horrifying. They chanted ominously, in a language Brandon couldn't understand. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the terrifying sight. Panic rose within him, and he knew he needed to leave. One of the cloaked figures pulled out a knife, and Brandon's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He couldn't stay here any longer. He had to run. Just as he was about to flee, the man Brandon had seen on the bridge appeared, stepping out of a small boat nearby, his hood falling back to reveal tattoos covering his pale skin. At that moment, the man pointed in Brandon's direction, and in an instant, it was clear he had seen him. The world around him seemed to fade into darkness, and the man's demonic eyes appeared to pierce through his soul. The discomfort Brandon had felt earlier on the bridge turned into pure terror as the man began to move toward him quickly and menacingly. Brandon's instincts kicked in immediately. He forgot about the poor man being held as a sacrifice and started running. He could hear the man's breath behind him as he ran through the brush, branches whipping against his face. The twigs scratched at his arms as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brandon was losing strength, and the distance to safety seemed endless. He finally emerged from the forest and onto the trail. The man and his cloak were still behind him, so he turned left toward the bridge. As there were no houses nearby and no one to call for help, the weight of exhaustion hit him, but there was no time to rest. He turned around and saw the man approaching, his face like a mask of rage. When he reached the middle of the suspension bridge, he stood there in disbelief and filled with fear. He looked at the wooden railing and read the mark that the cloaked man had written less than half an hour ago. It was barely legible, as it had been etched with a blade, but he was certain it read, Brandon McCain, August 7th, 1993, to October 20th, 2021. It was his name, along with his birth date. He realized that perhaps today would be a milestone in his life. And when he noticed the man approaching, holding a dagger, that could be the day he was about to die. The man swung the blade at him, and Brandon only had a few minutes to act. Brandon forgot all the legends, the depth, and the freezing temperatures, the river that could be a monster pulling him under. He didn't care. He lifted his right leg onto the railing, and as the man moved, Brandon dodged the blade that nearly pierced him. As the icy water splashed around him, his blood circulation became erratic. He only had enough time to look up and see the man on the bridge, still watching. But the freezing water dragged him down, and his body began to tremble as unbearable pain engulfed him. Brandon was nearly lost to disorientation, sinking slowly before closing his eyes, perhaps never to open them again. The Mystery of the Dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. Mysterious Treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and noticed the mess tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody.
There's nothing here. We should leave.
But Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
"We need to go. Now."
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
"My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute."
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The Window Stalker. It all started that day, when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then, he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice. "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard him and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine. We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. Two people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun. threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the two people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out, but I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive. Red bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait! Wait!
The man called out. She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted,
Help me! Help me! Help me!
As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. Well, you. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?
I replied, I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue. She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. Escape from the terrifying truck. On a Sunday afternoon, Mac and I decided to go hiking in some hills, just an hour's drive from the city. The hill we chose today had a fairly simple trail, not too steep, and when we reached the top, everything felt peaceful. just like any other time we had gone hiking. After a short rest, we started heading down, but just 10 minutes later, Mac began complaining about the rough path. He wanted to take a different trail down. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We hadn't seen another soul since we started our descent. Then we heard the sound of an engine. A rusty, heavy red truck was coming toward us. The man driving rolled down his window and flashed a smile that seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. He offered us a ride. Mac, always trusting, thought the guy seemed nice enough. I wasn't so sure. Mac begged and convinced me to get in, saying it was only a 10-minute drive. I was cautious, but I got in with him. Inside, the truck was shabby but clean. As we settled in, I instinctively started scanning my surroundings. My eyes were drawn to the floor, where I saw a coil of rope behind the driver's seat. Unease began to creep in. 10 minutes passed. We were no closer to the main road, and the woods around us grew denser. I asked the man how much longer it would take. He said we were just taking a different route and that we'd have to stop somewhere to pick up his stuff. We stopped in front of a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. There was an old tree stump out front, with a large axe stuck in it as if he had been chopping wood. I glanced at Mac, but he seemed excited and trusting of the man. The man turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He said,
"Stay here. I'll be right back."
As soon as he was out of sight, panic started to rise within me. I turned to Mac, pleading with him to leave, not to get out, but he didn't see the danger I saw. That's when I turned back to the truck and saw it. Half hidden under the driver's seat was an axe. Dark stains covered the blade stains that could only be blood. I quickly told Mac to look. He froze, his face turning pale as he realized the danger we were in. Without another word, we bolted into the forest, fleeing the imminent threat. We crashed through the thick underbrush, not caring where we were headed, as long as it was away from that cabin, trying to stay on a trail to avoid getting lost. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the wooden fence surrounding the parking lot. A wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw it. The man's truck was parked on the other side of the lot, engine off, lying in wait like a predator ready to pounce. Mac wanted to run to our car, but I held him back. The parking lot was too wide, too exposed for us to make a safe escape. We hid behind a large tree, cloaked in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As night fell, I heard a sound. The truck's door creaked open. The man climbed out, glancing around the forest once more. Mac made a mistake. He stepped on a branch, causing a snap. The man noticed and lingered for a moment, then started walking toward a nearby tree. We covered our mouths, hearts pounding, afraid to breathe or move as he came dangerously close to where we were hiding. Just then, a forest ranger approached the truck. The man seemed startled or afraid of being caught, so he quickly returned to his truck and drove away. As soon as he was gone, we bolted to our car, not stopping until we were inside with the doors locked. We sped out of there as fast as we could. That night, we drove in silence. The danger was behind us, but the fear lingered. As we finally returned to safety, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if we had stayed in that truck any longer. When we got back, we reported the incident to the forest rangers so they could investigate and warn other hikers to be more cautious. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house, but the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination, but night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her. But the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up. So I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties, so we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story. Buried for decades, the girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace. In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there. Haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Blue flames. I live in a suburb where there aren't many opportunities for hiking or camping. I will go camping for the first time in a remote forest. I think it will be a perfect camping trip because the land is flat. At the end of the trail, there will be a small pond. I walked for about an hour, but was a bit disappointed as it was quite small and surrounded by mud. However, it was enough for me to experience lying on a boat in the midst of nature. Suddenly, a thick mist crept through the bushes, clinging to the ground like a living entity that looked like a zombie rising from a grave. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of birds chirping echoed back, strangely distorted, indescribable. After setting up the tent in a drier spot, I asked him to take a walk around the lake because I saw quite a lot of interesting things around here. I wandered over to the other side of the pond, and there wasn't really much there, so I tried to go deeper. I suddenly discovered a mound of earth that looked like something had been buried recently, and it gradually emitted a very unpleasant smell. I turned my back. The fog was thick, covering the ghostly road, cold suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to head back to my camp, and by then, the sun was almost setting. I had a small lighter with me, so I used it to light a campfire and heat some food. I sat eating and chatting about everything with Tin. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. I was confused, wondering if there was anyone else out here besides us. Maybe I had disturbed them? As the sun set, I noticed a light hovering across the pond. It was within the trees just outside the pond, but I had walked there an hour earlier and knew there was nothing there. Tin jokingly said it might be a will-o'-the-wisp and that I should be careful or it would take me away. We joked around and then acted like nothing happened. At night, occasionally, I glanced over at the pond a bit. I wasn't sure what to do, but an hour later into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye that the light began to fade, and suddenly, a blue light flickered in the air and then disappeared. I didn't dare call Tin because he would punch me. I stared into the dark forest, feeling empty again. For about 10 minutes, I waited for the light to turn back on, but it didn't appear. That gave me chills, but I figured I must have been seeing things or dreaming. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness when my friend and I were suddenly awakened by a howling sound. Lights started flickering in front of the camp. I thought they were fireflies, so I asked Tin to go see because you rarely see this in the city. Tin and I decided to go on an adventure together. I must say we were really brave despite being a bit scared. Going deeper, the path opened up to a small clearing, surrounded by spindly trees with arrows on them. We immediately followed. Suddenly it was a mound. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. I approached and saw an ancient stone ring full of moss half buried in the ground. The air is thick with unspeakable fear, as if the stones themselves hold the memory of horrors. The tiny lights began to gather, swirling around each other to form a magical circle. This light illuminated the ground, creating strange patterns. My curiosity began to rise as I moved closer to take a closer look. I couldn't see clearly, but somewhere from under the mound of earth, something that looked like a horribly rotten hand like in those zombie movies emerged from the ground. Then the blue flames began to fly out rapidly like evil fireflies wanting to eat us, causing us to panic and not be able to run in time until we fell covered in mud. We started to panic. I screamed and waved a stick around instinctively, but Tin, being braver, took out his phone to take pictures. Moments later, we mysteriously lost consciousness and woke up near our tent. When I looked around, the blue light had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hooting of an owl. Tin, he took out his phone to check. The photos no longer seemed like a spiritual phenomenon. Just as dawn was breaking, we were too terrified and quickly left the forest, praying as we hurried away and vowing never to return. When I got back, I researched and found out that the forest was cursed with an ancient spell, which is why few people visit. We had gone without knowing. It was fortunate that we were still alive. The ghost of a mother in the forest. I was never someone who truly believed in ghosts. I always thought they were just products of imagination, created to explain the unexplainable. But everything changed when I was in that cursed forest. It was supposed to be a normal overnight trip, and quite an easy one. The locals whispered about the forest being haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to that. The road was rough, and the darkness grew thicker as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights barely cut through the fog, so I had to be more careful. Then suddenly, she appeared. An old woman stood in the middle of the road, hunched over, her eyes fixed on me as I stopped. I honked, but she didn't seem to hear. So I opened the door and shouted for her to move so I could pass. She didn't react at all. Instead, she slowly turned, looked straight at me, and asked, "Have you seen my daughter?" She kept asking, her voice growing more desperate. Then suddenly walked away, sobbing, leaving me confused and shaking. In my mind, I tried to dismiss the encounter with the woman as I continued my journey, but her words kept echoing in my head, gnawing at my sanity. When I finally made it out of the forest at dawn, I stopped at a small grocery store. The shopkeeper was kind, and I chatted with him for a while. But as I looked out the window, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the forest, staring at me. Fear started to creep in, and that's when the shopkeeper told me about her. He said that she had lost her mind after a tragic accident and now wanders the forest, searching for her long-lost daughter. I dismissed the story again, thinking it was just a coincidence. That night, as I drove back through the forest, the rain started pouring down heavily, making the road more dangerous. But I kept going, just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, through the rain, I saw another woman. But this time, she wasn't alone, and in her arms was a child who looked frail, almost lifeless. I intended to drive past. I hesitated, but my conscience wouldn't let me. I stopped and asked if they needed a ride. She looked pale, like she'd been out in the rain for too long. She nodded gratefully and climbed into my car with the child in her arms. I handed them a towel to dry off, and then she directed me to a hospital. When we arrived, she quietly thanked me before heading into the building. I sighed with relief, but as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the back of the car. It was the black umbrella she had been carrying. It was still in my car, and when I turned to look back at the hospital, I was almost paralyzed with what I saw. I looked away for just a few seconds, and when I looked back, they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the rain. Feeling confused, I decided it was best to leave as soon as possible. As I neared home, the rain was still pouring, and the parking lot was quite far from my house, so I had to use the black umbrella left in my truck. However, I felt a bit hesitant to use it, remembering that it belonged to the woman and her son, but I had no other choice. As I was walking, a strong gust of wind almost tore the umbrella from my hand, and suddenly, a wooden beam came crashing down from above, about to fall on me. It could have killed me, but the umbrella somehow pulled me to the side, saving my life. Shaking, I realized the umbrella wasn't just an ordinary umbrella. Perhaps it was a gift the woman left behind to protect me. The next morning, I went back to the grocery store, determined to uncover the truth. The shopkeeper hesitated, but finally told me the whole story. The woman and her child were spirits, doomed to wander the forest after a tragic accident. She died trying to protect her son. It happened on a stormy night when she was shunned and refused help by passing travelers. Some even splashed her with mud. She used her body to shield the child, but unfortunately, she slipped and fell off a cliff. On rainy days, if drivers refused to give her a ride, she would mysteriously appear in their cars and haunt them. Feeling a deep sense of injustice, she continues to seek out and punish those who don't help them. The old woman, unable to bear the unbearable pain of losing her daughter and grandson, went mad shortly after. Since that horrific accident, the villagers have often seen her holding a black umbrella, muttering nonsense. With a heavy heart, I visited their graves, returned the umbrella, and expressed my gratitude. As I walked away, I knew my life had changed forever. I had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, and from that day on, I would never doubt their existence again. Stranger at the campsite. A woman, Lena, in her 20s, stood at the edge of the familiar trail leading to her campsite. Her hiking backpack was slung over her shoulders, and a neatly rolled up tent was strapped to it. She breathed in the fresh air, savoring the tranquility of nature. Lena had been camping here for years, escaping the monotony of her small town. The forest was her refuge. Lena moved forward, following the trail leading to the lake. The setting sun filtered through the trees. She felt at home here, but today, a strange unease crept into her chest. As Lena rounded the corner and arrived at the clearing by the lake, her heart skipped a beat. Standing near the water's edge was a man. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing regular swim trunks and a faded white t-shirt. His small tent was already set up, not far from where hers would be. He was staring out across the lake, his back turned to her. Lena hesitated for a moment. She usually camped alone, and seeing someone else here made her feel uneasy. With a slight shrug, she moved a little further from his tent and began setting up her own. She gathered large stones, arranging them into a neat circle to prepare for her campfire later. As she was absorbed in her work, she noticed movement. The man was no longer facing the lake. He was staring directly at her, standing eerily still. Lena's heart raced. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her campfire. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. Her discomfort grew. She awkwardly raised her hand and waved. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he wanted to say hello. But after a moment of silence, the man simply turned and walked along the shore without acknowledging her. Lena frowned. Something about him didn't feel right, but she shook off the thought. She grabbed a chair and sat by the shore, determined to relax and enjoy the view. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Lena packed up her chair and returned to her campsite. She started a campfire, hoping to relax after the strange encounter. As she stared into the flames, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. A figure stood in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was the man in the white shirt. He had returned, standing there, watching from a distance. Lena quickly shifted her chair to the other side of the fire so she could face him. Time passed slowly. The man stood frozen in place as the forest around them grew darker. The shadows deepened, and soon, his figure became blurry, blending into the trees. Even though it was dark, Lena knew he was still there. He could see her clearly, illuminated by the fire, but she could no longer see him. Fear gnawed at her. What was he doing? Why hadn't he returned to his tent? Hours passed, and Lena remained tense, staring into the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and distant crickets. She considered leaving but feared the man might follow her, keeping her rooted in place. She stoked the fire, ensuring it burned brightly, knowing it was her only way to keep the surrounding darkness at bay. Lena sat by the campfire, her face blurred in the flickering firelight. The night was already thick with shadows. The forest around her was a pitch-black void. Her eyes continuously turned to the tree line where the man stood. Even though she could no longer see him, she knew he was still out there, following, waiting. Suddenly, a tree branch broke nearby. Lena stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her camp, squinting into the darkness. Perhaps he has already arrived. The flames cast long, flickering shadows. Lena couldn't stop imagining shapes moving among the trees. There, at the edge of the tree line, someone was probably standing there because she always heard footsteps crunching through the forest. Then slowly, the man's silhouette appeared. She regained her determination, suddenly stood up, picked up a thick branch from the fire, and held it as a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He remained still, watching her as if waiting for her next move. Lena shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling but firm, asking who he was and what he wanted from her, but there was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by her defiance. Lena's skin prickled with fear. She gripped the burning branch tightly and stepped closer to the edge of the campfire, ready to defend herself. But then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest. Slowly, cautiously. His footsteps were eerily soft. Lena watched him go, not daring to follow. He disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. She didn't believe he was truly gone. The night dragged on. Lena struggled to stay alert, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with fear. The fire had burned down, casting only a faint light. Despite her best efforts, her eyes began to droop. She couldn't fight it any longer. After only a short while, Lena was startled awake by a faint sound, her eyes snapping open. The fire was nearly out. Only a few embers remained. The air was cold and damp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had imagined the sound. But then she heard the faint rustling sound again, this time coming from behind the tent. Lena's heart raced. She stood up slowly, creeping carefully to avoid making any noise. She grabbed a nearly burnt-out branch from the fire, gripping it tightly. She cautiously walked around the tent, following the sound. The rustling grew louder as she approached the back of the tent. Lena tightened her grip on the branch. She took a deep breath and rounded the tent, only to find a squirrel nibbling away. The area behind the tent was empty. Lena frowned, confused. She could have sworn she heard something like footsteps. She returned to the fire, scanning the surroundings. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Lena's body was stiff from sitting for hours, her eyes heavy from the sleepless night. It seemed like she was very lucky. For some reason, the man never returned, and she saw no sign of him for hours. But the insecurity is still there. Lena quickly packed her things, wasting no time. She glanced nervously at the tree line. The forest remained quiet and still, as if the events of the previous night had never happened, and she wished that were true. She slung her backpack over her shoulders and began walking briskly toward her car. Her legs trembled. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made her jump, but the trail remained empty. As Lena neared the parking lot, she began to feel a sense of relief. She could see her car up ahead, the only vehicle in sight. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the forest and the strange man behind. But as she reached the clearing, she froze in her tracks. His tent was still there. She slowly, cautiously, walked toward it. The tent flap was slightly open, the inside dark, but there was nothing there. Lena backed away, her mind racing. What kind of game was this? Was he even real? She snapped out of it and hurried toward her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she started the engine, and drove off. As Lena sped down the winding road, she glanced into her rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the man in the white shirt. His hand was raised, thumb out, as if hitchhiking. Lena pressed the gas pedal harder, her car speeding away, and she never looked back or returned to that forest again. It left her with an unforgettable memory, perhaps the worst camping trip she'd ever had. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, Casey, We need to call the police. Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. "They're trying to get in," I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. "Call the police," I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, "We need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door." With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, "Maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all." Mysterious man at the fast food restaurant. I had been working at this 24-hour fast food restaurant for years. Most of my night shifts were quiet. However, tonight was different. The night started like any normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Our night cook called in sick, leaving me to manage the whole restaurant alone until someone could assist at 4 a.m. The silence in the restaurant was eerie. With no customers around, I spent time cleaning the kitchen, focusing on scrubbing away the grime. Then, I heard a loud noise coming from the front of the restaurant. There was a man outside the entrance. He was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, peering inside and banging on the door. He didn't seem normal, which made me feel uneasy. The door was locked. I approached the glass, trying to stay calm, and gestured for him to go around to the drive-thru. He didn't respond, just stared. I shouted through the glass that the dining area was closed, but he didn't move, just stood there, lifeless. I turned and went back to the kitchen. I tried to continue working, focusing on my tasks. 15 minutes passed, and I convinced myself that he must have left. But the unease still lingered. A beep went off in my headset. Someone had placed an order. I turned on the mic and asked for their order, but all I got was silence. I checked the camera at the drive-through lane, no car, no sign of anyone. I sighed and turned away, but then I froze. I heard something, footsteps, light, careful steps coming from above, as if someone was walking on the roof. I tracked the noise until it stopped at the ladder leading to the maintenance door in the ceiling. The footsteps halted above. I was sure someone was up there. I quickly searched for a lock or anything to secure the door. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure if it could even lock. I heard the trapdoor creak. It was slowly beginning to open. A small gap appeared, and through it, I saw a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring at me. Panic consumed me, and without thinking, I turned and ran toward the front door. I bolted outside to my car, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Trembling, I called the police and described what was happening. From the safety of my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my eyes scanning the windows, and then I saw him. A shadow moving near the counter. For a moment, he looked directly at me, then suddenly darted into the kitchen. The police arrived and searched the entire building, inside and out, even checking the roof. But the man had vanished, disappeared as if he had never been there. Nothing was stolen. No money, no equipment, nothing was missing. He had broken in, but he didn't take anything from the restaurant, like a strange stalker. After the police left, I sat in my car, staring at the darkened restaurant. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw him look at me in such a strange and unsettling way. I went back to work. My boss had installed a lock on the ceiling door, a safety measure that should have been done long ago. But my job was never the same. From then on, I startled at every sound, never knowing if he would come back. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles, just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form of a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looked sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. The man passed through the door. It was a quiet evening. Abby was home alone as usual. Her mother often had to work 2 jobs in one day, from morning to late at night. So Abby had to take care of herself most of the time, and she was used to it. The house was peaceful. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, so she took care of everything herself from cooking to locking up, getting ready for bed. Before going to bed, Abby planned to relax a bit. She sat on the couch, ready to watch TV with a tub of ice cream in her hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She froze, spoon of ice cream halfway to her mouth. It was strange her friends never visited this late, and her mom always used her key. Confused, she slowly walked to the door. She wasn't exactly scared, just curious. She opened the door and saw him a man. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking on. He was bald, wore thick glasses, and had a scruffy beard with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem threatening, but something felt off. Abby greeted him, and the man smiled and asked, "Hello, little girl. Are your parents home?" At the time, she didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a friendly question. So Abby foolishly answered that her mom wasn't home. A smile spread across his face, but then she started to feel uneasy as his questions grew too interested. He smiled and said, "Good night. Don't get into any trouble," then walked away. Abby didn't understand what had just happened, so she closed the door. Her heart was racing, but she pushed it aside. He was just being friendly, she told herself. Abby returned to her ice cream. Her mind replayed the conversation. Something about the way he had looked at her and smiled made her feel uneasy. 10 minutes passed, and she began to feel comfortable again. The strange encounter faded from her mind. Then, there was another knock at the door. She thought it might be him again. This time, something told her to be cautious. She wasn't sure why, but before opening the door, she decided to lock the chain. When Abby opened the door, the chain caught, preventing it from opening fully. And there he was, the same man from earlier. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he pretended to be friendly again. He stammered a greeting to Abby again, and said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. To her, he no longer seemed friendly. He looked desperate, as if realizing he hadn't gotten into the house and was trying to cover it up. Abby gave a quick thank you out of fear and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. She stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Minutes passed, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man. But every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. She needed her mom and wished she were home. Suddenly, she heard the man's voice again, this time coming from the mail slot of the front door. He was whispering through the slot, saying he wanted to come in and had something to tell Abby. Abby froze in place. She screamed, "Leave me alone." The mail slot slammed shut, and then the pounding on the door started. He was banging hard, rattling the doorknob violently, shouting crude words demanding she open the door. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, silently praying he wouldn't get in. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to force the door open. For what felt like an eternity, Abby stood there, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Perhaps the man had given up and left. She didn't move, only standing there, listening. About 30 minutes later, Abby's mom came home. The door opened, and she rushed in, finding her daughter in tears. Abby told her everything. Her mom immediately called the police about the incident, but they didn't find any trace of the man. As Abby lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have used the door chain. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, but it had saved her.